Okay, now that we have the scene set up for Pong, we're going to first let's work on the ball first. Let's get the ball moving and doing what it should do for Pong. So to do that, we're going to select the ball here, and we need to add a component to it, a script component. And we're going to be using diagram for this, so we're going to use visual scripting. You should have your Virtual Hammer folder right here when you installed your diagram thing, which you watched from the video, the installation video. And all we have to do for that is we have to add a component, come down to Virtual Hammer, Diagram, and add a diagram behavior, and you're going to see this pop up. And if you click the editor button, you're going to see this editor come up so that we can start scripting in here. And I'm just going to dock it right here. You can drag it and dock it up next to those other windows. So here's where we're going to go over some of the scripting concepts that we covered in the scripting lecture. To use diagram, you should have watched the how to use diagram video, so you should be familiar with how to add variables in events. But this is the start function, and as mentioned in the lecture, start happens once when this starts up. I know I'm going to need an update function, so I'm going to go to base events, click on the button right here, the plus, base events, add an update function. I also know I'm going to need an on-collision enter function because the ball has to collide with things. So I'm going to go to physics, on-collision enter. And so these are my events that we discussed in the lecture on start, update, and on-collision enter. So we have to start thinking, now we have to start designing the ball and start thinking, what do we need for the ball to, when do we need to interact with the ball? And what do we need for the ball in the terms of variables? So the ball needs to move. I know that the ball needs to move, and I want to move the ball with velocity. So to do that, as mentioned in the previous lectures, if I want something to have velocity, that means physics. And if I want something to have physics, I'm going to have to add a rigid body component to it. So I'm going to add component, go down to physics, add rigid body. And so I'm going to set up my rigid body here. The ball doesn't have gravity in Pong, so I'm not going to use any gravity with this. The ball also, I don't want it to move on the Z. I do not want the ball to move in and out of the screen. It has to stay in this space. So I'm going to click freeze position, and I don't want the ball rotating at all. So I'm going to freeze all the rotations on that ball. And so if I click back to diagram, you're going to see that I'm going to need to make some variables here first. So let's make, and to make add a variable, I'm just clicking the plus here, drag this over, and I'm going to choose the type of variable I want. Remember, the variables are just containers for data, and they all have a type. So I'm going to drop this down. I want to control how fast the ball goes. So I'm going to use a float for that because I want some precision on it. And I'm just going to add a name to it. The name I want for this float is speed. I'm going to create that one. This is a simple variable. Remember we talked about just simple variables. We talked about complex variables. I'm also going to add a vector 3 and call this direction. I'm going to have to keep track of what direction this thing is going. And a vector 3 is more of a complex, it's a structure, X, Y, and Z. I also need to talk to this rigid body component here. So I need to get access to this rigid body component. And to do that, I'm going to make a rigid body variable. Remember I said you can make variables for anything, so this would be a more complex type of variable. And I'm going to call this ball RB for rigid body. And you can see when I was talking about some more complex variables, they need to be filled in. This is just an empty container for a rigid body. Unity is nice because it'll fill in these simple ones here. So this already has zeros in it as a value. But this component variable for rigid body is not filled in yet. You can see that it says none. And this gets a lot of people, when they say their stuff's not working, they forget to fill this variable in. I need to talk to this component specifically. So I'm going to drag this rigid body up into there. And you can now see that it is the rigid body that's on the ball. It says it right there. So this is why visual scripting is pretty good. some of the concepts become pretty clear, that this is now a assigned filled-in variable, and you can see what it's assigned to in this space. So now that I have these variables, we have to ask ourselves, when does this happen? What is the behavior of the ball? So the first thing the ball has to do when moves is move. So when does the ball move? Well, it moves right when the game starts in old school Pong. So I'm going to choose start as my event that I want to use, because I can do in start, I can just set the velocity once and it will continue to go, because velocity is a constant force that I'm just going to set, and it should continue to go in that space. So to set the velocity, what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to access and talk to this rigid body. So to do that, I'm going to right click, drop down variables, go to ball RB, that is the variable that I made there. I also can right click here, or left click there, and go add to graph. And it will add this variable right here. And what I can do with this is if I drag off of this, left click and drag, what I want to do is I want to talk to the velocity. So I'm just going to type velocity in. And you can see there's a bunch of different things that the rigid body deals with velocity. But what I want to deal with is I want to set the velocity of this ball. So I'm just going to add that in right there. And remember, in visual scripting, you need to, the execution pins, you need to hook them up. So I need to, when this fires off, it's going to come into here, and it's going to set the rigid body velocity. Now, right now, it's going to set it to 0. So I don't want it to set it to 0. What I want it to set to is whatever direction I want it to be in times the speed. So I'm going to set my speed to 5. Click in here, set my speed to 5. And my direction, I want it to go diagonal and up, or up diagonal to the right. So I'm going to do 1 on the X and 1 on the Y. So that's going to be X and Y, up on the Y, over on the X. It's going to go diagonal in a direction like that. And I want to multiply this by speed so that I can control the speed of how fast I want this ball to go. So I'm going to add to graph, add this, and I want to drag off of this, and I'm just going to hit the multiply sign. And I don't want a quaternion vector, I want to multiply a vector 3. And you can see that you multiply this by a float. All of these are color-coded, so components are blue, floats are green, vectors are yellow, strings are pink, bools are red. You can see that this wants a vector. That's what it wants in there, because it's yellow. So we match these up. It wants a vector. But I have to multiply this by something. So if I drag back off of this, I'm just going to add speed right there. And the reason we have a variable here, if I just typed in speed right here, I could disconnect this and just type in speed at 5. But since it's not a variable, I would never have access to change this. This is what we call hard coding this value. So since I may want to change it at some point in time, I'm going to use this variable, and now I can change this variable whenever I want, and it will affect the speed of the ball. And now this multiplied this vector, 1, 1, 0, times 5 is now going to become 5, 5, 0. And I'm going to add it in. And if I do that, I should see the ball move now. I'm hitting play, and there it goes. Do it again. You can see the ball. I set the velocity, and it goes up to the top, up and to the right at a speed of 5. So that's great. We accessed our rigid body by making a variable. We made variables for speed and for the direction. And in start, we said, hey, when you come to life once, right at the beginning, set your rigid body's velocity to direction times speed. And that gives you a new vector that it's going to go. So that's great. We have a moving ball, but you can see that when we play that, it does not bounce right now. It just goes there and bounces. And it doesn't bounce because we didn't tell it to bounce. So we have to do some logic on that. And again, we have to think, when do we want this to happen? And when this happens, or when we want it to bounce, is when it hits something, anything. We want the ball to bounce. When the ball hits anything, it bounces. So that would be a time for on collision enter, the event that is called when you collide with something, on collision enter. So I'm going to click on that tab on this event. You see I have a fresh new graph for this event. And there's some things that I have to do here. What I want is I want something called vector reflect. I want to reflect the vector. The vector that this thing is moving is the direction times speed. And when it hits this thing, I want to reflect it like a mirror, so it bounces. So what I'm looking for is vector reflect. So I'm going to type in vector. I could probably just type in reflect. It gives me a bunch for that. Let's type in vector 3 reflect. This is what I want. Vector 3 reflect. And you can see this is when we were talking about functions. Remember, we made variables, we talked about events. This is the first function we're using, and this is a unity function. If I right-click on here and I go to documentation, this is what I was talking about in the lecture with the return type is a vector 3. The name is vector 3 reflect, and in the parentheses it takes in 2 vector 3s as its parameters. So this is the information it needs to solve its problem. This is the type of data it spits back out when the problem is solved. So that's what functions do. They're kind of magic boxes that you give it information and it spits out an answer for you. Some of them just do actions. But what this wants in is it wants the in direction, and the in direction is just the way that my ball is traveling. That's the way it's moving. And it wants the vector 3 normal. And the normal is the surface of the thing that it hits. So in this space, the direction would be how it's traveling here. The normal of this surface is down. So it's the direction of the surface that I hit. Which way is that pointing? The normal of the floor would be up. The normal of the ceiling would be down. The normal of this paddle would be right on this side. And you get it. So the normal, surface normal is the normal, the way that the surface is pointing. So I need to find this information to pass into this. And I have this information here. So what I'm going to do is, since I multiplied this by speed, I want to assign this every frame back to what it actually is, what the whole speed is, not just the direction component of it. So when I want to do something every frame, that's a good candidate for update, because update, I want to assign it to what the speed actually is. Right now it's just a direction, and in start I multiplied these two together. But right now what I want to do is I'm going to say, hey, rigid body, give me get the velocity. I want to get, I'll type in velocity get. I want to get how the rigid body is moving. What is your velocity? And then I want to set the direction to that. So every frame, I'm going to come in and I'm going to say, hey, ball, how are you moving? Get your velocity and set this variable back to whatever your velocity is at every frame. So now direction is the correct direction that comes into this. Now here's where this gets interesting. How do I know what the surface normal is of the thing that I hit? Well, on collision enter, this little tab right here, this collision, this gives me information about what happened when I hit something. So if I drag off of this and let go, you can see under the collision, I can get a lot of information about the thing that I hit or what happened with this collision. And what I want to get here is I want contacts get, because contacts are the points at which I hit something. These are all the contact points, and there could be more than one, because I can hit something with more than one point. So you'll see that this is an array right here, and this array, we'll discuss these a little bit later. An array is just a list of variables of the same type. So this holds a list of contact points. It holds them all a data type that holds a bunch of contact points. And we can get information from this. I can drag off of this. And under array, what I want is I want get element at index. Because the index is the array is sub 0. The index 0 is the first object in that array. And I just want the first point right now. That's all I really care about, is the first point. So you'll see that this is an operation, so it has these data execution plugs that we need to go through. But I don't want a contact point because that won't go in here. That's not what I need. What I need, if I drag off of this, is the first thing that's on there is normal get. So normal get is, I want the contact points normal, and that's the surface normal. That's the normal of the surface that I actually hit. So if I take this and pass this into here, and then hook this up, I am calling vector reflect, and that's great, but it's not going to do anything yet, because I did the function here. I called the function, I gave it what it needed, and it's giving me the answer. It's giving it right here. I'm just not doing anything with it yet. So what I want to do with it is I want to change the velocity of the ball when it hits. On collision enter, calculate the reflection vector that comes off, and then let's set the rigid body velocity to that. So I'm going to add this rigid body. I'm going to drag off of the blue. I'm going to type in velocity, if I can spell it right, velocity, and I want set, velocity set. And the velocity I want to set is whatever comes out of vector reflect. And now, if we do this correctly, we should see, I'm going to drag this to the side here so we can see it work. So every time it hits something, you can see this pulsing through here. It stopped pulsing. I don't know, did it go out of the world? Do I have a... What is happening here? Hold on. Let me see what's happening. I want you to go, and you should continue to bounce. Oh, it's getting caught right in the corner there, so it doesn't know how to bounce correctly, which is interesting. It got stuck perfectly in the corner. We can fix that. I'm just going to take the ball in the scene and hit W. I'm going to move it just a little bit. Actually, no. I'm going to... Yeah, that's fine. We'll just move it a little bit to the left. That's crazy because it had to perfectly land in the corner to get stuck like that. But now you should see that every time that ball's hitting something, you can see that this pulses, and you can see the code actually run through. It's going to get the vector and set the velocity. Updates running all the time. You can see this, that updates continuously setting this vector to whatever it was, and start just happened once. So start already happened, and we can't see it run anymore. I am actually, because when I reset the ball, I'm going to set it back to 0, and I don't want it to get stuck in that corner again. So I'm going to take this goal right here, and I'm just going to move it back a little bit. And I'm going to take the ball, and I'm going to put it back to the 0 position here. Right here, click 0. Now hopefully that fixes that getting stuck issue. It did. It had to fit in there perfectly to actually mess that up. Interesting. Anyway, that is the ball. So the concepts we used, we had these events. We said, I want to do something on start. When the ball becomes alive, I want to set its velocity. To do that, we said, what variables do I need to accomplish what I want? Well, I needed a rigid body variable to talk to my rigid body component right here. So I made a rigid body variable and assigned it by dragging ball. I made a speed variable so that I can control this speed if I want to. I made a direction variable, and so this direction variable said this is how I'm going to control what direction it moves initially and multiply it by speed. In update, I'm saying I want to assign this back to what it should be all the time. So in update all the time, every frame, I'm saying ball rigid body, set the velocity, or get the velocity of that, and set this vector, this variable vector that I have here. And then in on collision enter, I said, hey, when you hit something, anything, I want to calculate the reflection and set the rigid body's velocity to that reflection. And you have a functioning ball.